The spring of 1945 arrived in Europe like a bloody dawn, breaking through the smoke of 1,000 burning cities. From the shattered Rhine bridges to the crumbling bastions of the Third Reich, Allied armies surged forward like an inexorable tide, washing away the last desperate defenders of Hitler's collapsing empire. Every day brought new victories, new liberated towns, new photographs of smiling soldiers posing before captured Nazi banners. The world watched this grand finale of the most devastating war in human history, eager to witness the inevitable triumph of good over evil, justice over tyranny. Yet, beneath the triumphant fanfares and the carefully orchestrated narratives of righteousness, another story unfolded, one written not in official communiques or heroic dispatches, but in whispered conversations, hastily buried reports, and the haunted eyes of men who had seen too much. For war, that ancient beast feeding on human souls, does not distinguish between the uniforms of its servants. It corrupts all who venture too close to its flames, transforming ordinary men into instruments of violence, blurring the sacred lines between soldier and executioner, between duty and murder. In the spring of 1945, as church bells rang out across newly freed villages and politicians prepared their victory speeches, 80 German soldiers drew their last breaths in a moment that would be deliberately erased from the official record. They died not in the heat of battle, not defending some strategic position or making a desperate last stand, but as prisoners of war, disarmed, defeated, and utterly defenseless. Their executioners wore the uniform of liberation, carried weapons stamped with the symbols of democracy, and served under commanders who spoke eloquently about moral superiority and the rule of law. This is not a story the victors chose to tell. It does not fit comfortably into the neat moral framework of the good war, that sanitized narrative where Allied forces fought with honor against an unambiguously evil enemy. It is a story that was buried, quite literally, in unmarked graves and metaphorically in sealed files, classified reports, and the selective amnesia of official military history. For decades, it would remain hidden, a dark stain, carefully concealed beneath layers of bureaucratic whitewash and willful forgetting. At the center of this suppressed chapter stands one of America's most celebrated military commanders, a general whose name became synonymous with aggressive warfare, tactical brilliance, and uncompromising leadership. General George S. Patton, the pearl-handled, pistol-wearing warrior poet who believed war was humanity's highest calling, faced a choice that spring: expose a war crime committed by his own men and risk tarnishing the reputation of the victorious American army, or bury the truth deep enough that it might never surface. He chose concealment. The decision would reveal uncomfortable truths about the nature of command, the limits of accountability, and the moral compromises that even the most righteous wars demand. It would raise questions that still echo through the decades. What happens when liberators become killers? Who judges the judges when the victors write history? And what price does a nation pay when it chooses convenient mythology over uncomfortable truth? This is the story of those 80 men who died in the shadow of victory. But it is also the story of the soldiers who killed them, the commander who covered it up, and the investigative machinery that ground to a halt when the truth became inconvenient. It is a story about the intoxicating power of moral certainty and the dangerous delusions it breeds. Most of all, it is a reminder that even the most just causes do not automatically sanctify all actions taken in their name. The spring of 1945 was supposed to be pure triumph. Instead, it became a testament to war's ability to corrupt even those fighting on the side of angels, and to the lengths powerful men will go to preserve a comforting lie. To understand how American soldiers, boys from Iowa farms and Brooklyn tenements, raised on baseball and apple pie, schooled in democratic values and Christian morality, could line up disarmed prisoners and cut them down in cold blood, one must first descend into the psychological inferno of late war Europe. By the spring of 1945, the men wearing American uniforms were no longer the fresh-faced volunteers who had stormed Normandy's beaches 10 months earlier. They were something else entirely, hardened, brutalized, and carrying within them a fury that had been systematically cultivated through months of unimaginable horror. The transformation had begun in the killing fields of France, accelerated through the frozen hell of the Ardennes, and reached its terrible apotheosis in the concentration camps of Germany. These men had witnessed their friends torn apart by German artillery, watched comrades bleed out in muddy foxholes, calling for their mothers, and carried the broken bodies of brothers in arms through landscapes that resembled medieval paintings of hell. War had stripped away the veneer of civilization, exposing the raw animal beneath, and the animal was learning to hate with a purity that would have shocked the civilians back home. December 1944 had been the breaking point for many. During the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate last gamble in the West, American soldiers experienced a level of brutality that shattered any remaining illusions about civilized warfare. At Malmedy, SS troops had herded 84 captured American prisoners into a snow-covered field and methodically murdered them with machine guns and pistols, walking among the wounded to deliver coup de grace shots to those still moving. Survivors who played dead beneath the bodies of their friends listened to the laughter of their executioners and the screams of men being finished off with single bullets to the head. The news of Malmedy spread through American units like wildfire, transforming abstract concepts of enemy into visceral hatred for a specific, monstrous foe. Suddenly, every German soldier became a potential SS murderer, every raised hand of surrender a possible trick, every plea for mercy a manipulation. The massacre had torn the fragile agreement that even in war, certain lines would not be crossed. And once that agreement shattered, the descent into mutual savagery accelerated with terrifying speed. The psychological architecture of restraint, carefully constructed through training and military law, began to crumble. Officers who might have enforced strict rules about prisoner treatment found themselves questioning whether such niceties made sense when facing an enemy who machine-gunned the helpless. Chaplains who preached mercy struggled to find words that could penetrate the armor of rage their men had built around their hearts. The men themselves, exhausted beyond human endurance, operating on cigarettes and benzodrine and pure adrenaline, discovered that killing had become easier than thinking, that revenge felt more natural than compassion. Then came the camps. As American forces drove deeper into Germany in March and April 1945, they began stumbling upon places that defied human comprehension. Industrial facilities designed for the mass production of death. Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Dachau, names that would become synonymous with absolute evil. Soldiers who had considered themselves hardened by combat found themselves vomiting uncontrollably at the sight of walking skeletons, piles of emaciated corpses stacked like cordwood, ovens still containing human remains, torture chambers where medical experiments had been conducted on living prisoners. General Dwight Eisenhower, upon visiting Ohrdruf, was so shaken that he ordered every American unit in the vicinity to tour the camp, believing that soldiers needed to see with their own eyes what they were fighting against. It was a decision born of noble intentions to provide moral clarity and righteous purpose, but it had an unintended consequence. The camps became permission slips for vengeance. If this was what the Germans had done, what mercy did they deserve? If this was the enemy's true face, what rules still applied? The psychological impact cannot be overstated. These were not professional soldiers accustomed to compartmentalizing horror. They were citizen soldiers, many still teenagers, whose moral frameworks had been built in small-town America, where the worst violence most had witnessed was a bar fight or a hunting accident. Now they were being asked to process industrial genocide, to make sense of a level of organized cruelty that their minds simply could not accommodate. The cognitive dissonance was resolved through rage, pure, cleansing, simplifying rage that reduced complex moral questions to a single burning imperative: make them pay. The dehumanization was mutual and self-reinforcing. German soldiers, fighting now on their own soil with their families in the path of Allied armies, fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Hitler Youth, some as young as 12, fired Panzer Fausts from rubble piles and were cut down by American machine guns. Old men from the Volkssturm, Germany's last-ditch militia, died defending villages with World War I rifles. Every house could be a death trap. Every cellar might hide a sniper. Every white flag might be a ruse. In this environment of total war and mutual terror, the distinction between combatant and civilian, between soldier and war criminal, blurred into meaninglessness. American soldiers began developing their own informal rules of engagement, passed through whispered conversations in foxholes and knowing glances between veterans. Don't take unnecessary chances. Don't trust surrenders from SS troops. Don't risk your life to accept a prisoner when a bullet is safer. These weren't official orders. They were the survival wisdom of men who had learned that mercy could get you killed, that hesitation meant death, that in the final accounting, your buddy's life mattered more than any Geneva Convention. The fury was also fueled by exhaustion of a kind that civilians could never comprehend. By April 1945, some American units had been in continuous combat for months, sleeping in muddy holes, eating cold rations, watching friends die daily. They were beyond tired. They were operating in a fugue state where normal human emotions had been replaced by a numb automaticity, punctuated by explosive violence. In this condition, the moral reasoning required to properly process surrendering prisoners, to see them as human beings entitled to protection rather than threats to be eliminated, simply exceeded their depleted psychological resources. Commander after commander noted the change in their men. These were no longer the idealistic warriors who had landed in Normandy singing songs and cracking jokes. They were hollow-eyed killers who had learned to switch off empathy like a light, who could execute a prisoner and then sit down to eat a meal without missing a beat. The war had carved away everything soft, leaving only the hard core of survival instinct and tribal loyalty. They would die for each other, kill for each other, and increasingly, they would commit atrocities for each other, because the only morality that still made sense was the morality of the squad, the platoon, the band of brothers who understood what they had endured. Into this cauldron of rage, trauma, and moral collapse walked 80 German prisoners in the spring of 1945. They surrendered to men who had stopped seeing Germans as fellow human beings and had started seeing them as embodiments of Malmedy, as representatives of Buchenwald, as symbols of every friend they had buried and every horror they had witnessed. The prisoners were entering a space where normal rules no longer applied, where the thin veneer of military discipline and legal restraint had been burned away by months of mutual atrocity. The fury of a generation cultivated through calculated brutality and horrific discovery was about to find its outlet. And when it did, the question would not be why it happened, but why anyone thought it wouldn't. George Smith Patton, Jr. stood before the mirror each morning and saw not merely a general, but a warrior king reborn across millennia, a reincarnation of Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, all the great captains of history whose spirits he believed flowed through his veins. The man who commanded the U.S. Third Army in the spring of 1945 was not simply a military officer executing orders from above. He was a force of nature, a walking contradiction, a brilliant tactician wrapped in layers of calculated theatricality and genuine megalomania. To understand how 80 murders could be swept under the carpet of history, one must first understand the man who wielded the broom. Patton's philosophy of war was brutally simple and utterly uncompromising. War was humanity's highest calling, the ultimate test of manhood, and the only true measure of a nation's vitality. He despised what he called the softness of modern civilization, believing that democratic societies had become dangerously feminized, that men had forgotten their primal purpose as warriors. War, to Patton, was not a necessary evil, but a glorious opportunity, a chance to prove one's worth in the ancient crucible of combat, to experience the transcendent clarity that comes only when death stalks every moment. "We're not just going to shoot the bastards," he famously told his troops before D-Day, his voice rising to a theatrical crescendo. "We're going to rip out their living goddamn guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks." This was not mere motivational rhetoric. It was the authentic voice of a man who genuinely believed that maximum violence, applied with overwhelming force and absolute ruthlessness, was not just militarily effective, but morally superior. Hesitation was weakness. Mercy was failure. The only honor lay in total, crushing, annihilating victory. His appearance was as carefully crafted as any Hollywood production. The ivory-handled revolvers, not pearl, as he would angrily correct anyone who made that mistake, gleaming at his hips. The riding boots polished to a mirror shine. The perfectly tailored uniforms adorned with every medal and decoration he had earned or, in some cases, designed for himself. The lacquered helmet liner that caught the sun like a crown. Every element was calculated to project an image of martial supremacy, to remind everyone who saw him that they were in the presence of a warrior who had transcended mere mortality to become something greater, something terrible and magnificent. But beneath the theatrical bravado lived a far more complex and troubled soul. Patton was a man of genuine literary sophistication who wrote poetry and wept at classical music. He was a devoted husband who wrote tender letters home while simultaneously maintaining a fierce public persona of hypermasculinity. He suffered from dyslexia and had struggled academically at West Point, yet he possessed a brilliant tactical mind that could visualize battles with three-dimensional clarity. He believed literally in reincarnation, convinced he had fought as a Roman legionnaire, a Greek hoplite, a Napoleonic cavalry officer, and that he would fight again in future wars, across future lifetimes, forever. This belief in his own immortal warrior essence shaped his approach to command in profound and disturbing ways. Patton genuinely did not fear death, not because he was particularly brave, but because he believed death was merely a temporary interruption in his eternal martial destiny. This made him fearless in combat and ruthlessly demanding of his subordinates. He expected his men to embrace death as eagerly as he did, to charge into machine gun fire with the same transcendent joy he would have felt, to sacrifice themselves without hesitation for the glory of victory. His treatment of soldiers who failed to meet his impossible standards of warrior perfection was legendary and often cruel. The infamous slapping incidents where Patton physically struck soldiers suffering from what we now recognize as PTSD, calling them cowards and ordering them back to the front, revealed the dark underbelly of his warrior philosophy. Men who broke under the unbearable strain of combat were not victims deserving compassion, but failures who had betrayed their masculine duty. Weakness was not to be treated, but punished, not understood, but eliminated. Yet this same brutal commander inspired fanatical loyalty in many of his troops. His Third Army raced across France with a speed that astonished both allies and enemies, capturing more territory and killing more enemy soldiers than any other American formation. Patton led from the front, exposing himself to enemy fire with a recklessness that terrified his staff officers. He visited forward positions constantly, often appearing in the thick of battle when more cautious commanders stayed safely behind the lines. His men saw that he demanded nothing of them that he would not risk himself, and many loved him for it. Patton's view of the enemy was complicated by his peculiar code of warrior honor. He respected German military professionalism, particularly the aggressive tactics of panzer commanders who thought and fought like he did. He saw the Wehrmacht as worthy adversaries, fellow warriors engaged in humanity's oldest and noblest pursuit. This was not affection or sympathy. Patton wanted to utterly destroy the German army, but it was a kind of professional respect, the acknowledgement of one predator recognizing another. The SS, however, occupied a different category in his taxonomy of enemies. These were not honorable warriors, but fanatics, thugs elevated to military status, men who had perverted the warrior code with their ideology and their atrocities. Patton viewed them with a contempt usually reserved for civilians who pretended to be soldiers. Yet even this contempt was filtered through his obsession with victory above all else. What mattered was winning, crushing the enemy so completely that they could never rise again. How that was accomplished, what rules were bent or broken along the way, mattered far less than the final outcome. This utilitarian approach to military ethics would prove crucial when the massacre occurred. For Patton, the paramount consideration was always operational effectiveness. Anything that might slow his advance, demoralize his troops, or complicate his command was to be eliminated swiftly and decisively. A scandal involving American soldiers murdering prisoners would do all three. It would trigger investigations, divert resources, undermine morale, and perhaps most importantly to Patton, reflect badly on his leadership. Moreover, Patton operated in a broader political context that shaped his choices. By spring 1945, he was already a controversial figure, saved from dismissal after the slapping incidents only by his undeniable tactical brilliance and the intervention of General Eisenhower. He was constantly at odds with his superiors, chafing under what he considered overcautious restrictions, making inflammatory statements to the press, and generally behaving like a prima donna who believed his military genius exempted him from normal rules of conduct and discipline. Patton also harbored increasingly radical political views that alarmed his superiors. He advocated for continuing the war directly into the Soviet Union, arguing that America should destroy Stalin's regime while American forces were mobilized and positioned. He made openly sympathetic statements about former Nazi officials, suggesting they would be useful in the coming conflict with communism. His growing reputation as a political loose cannon made him simultaneously more valuable. No other commander could match his aggressive warfare, and more vulnerable to any scandal that might provide an excuse to remove him. Into this volatile mixture of genuine military brilliance, calculated theatricality, warrior mysticism, and political recklessness came news of a war crime committed by his men. For Patton, the calculus was clear. Exposure would damage his army's reputation, his own reputation, and the broader American war effort at a crucial moment. The Germans had committed far worse atrocities. He had personally toured concentration camps and been sickened by what he saw. In his mind, 80 dead German prisoners, tragic though it might be, hardly registered against the millions murdered in death camps and the hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers killed in combat. The decision to suppress the truth was not made in a vacuum of pure moral failing. It was made by a man who genuinely believed he was serving a higher purpose, protecting his soldiers and his mission from consequences he deemed disproportionate to the offense. Patton saw himself as a warrior king whose duty was to his men and his mission, not to abstract legal principles or squeamish civilians back home who couldn't understand the brutal necessities of war. But this was the same logic that authoritarians and war criminals have employed throughout history. The end justifies the means. Necessity knows no law. We fight for civilization by temporarily abandoning it. Patton, for all his brilliance and charisma, was not immune to the moral corruption that absolute power breeds. He had come to believe that he, personally, was above the rules that bound lesser men, that his destiny as an eternal warrior exempted him from the petty constraints of military justice and international law. When the moment came to choose between truth and expedience, between accountability and reputation, George S. Patton, warrior, poet, tactical genius, believer in his own immortal greatness, chose the path that would bury 80 bodies a second time, this time beneath paperwork and lies. The Iron Lord of War revealed himself to be, after all, merely human, capable of moral cowardice despite physical courage, willing to compromise justice for convenience, ready to sacrifice principles on the altar of ambition. The general who believed he would live forever as a warrior was about to prove that even legends can become accomplices to murder. And in that moment, the man who saw himself as history's greatest soldier became merely another commander who chose his career over the truth. April 15, 1945. The date would be deliberately obscured in official records, the location reduced to vague references, the participants' names redacted into anonymity. But the day itself burned itself into the memories of those who witnessed it. A spring morning, when the carefully maintained fiction of American moral superiority dissolved in a hail of bullets that lasted less than 3 minutes. The setting was somewhere in Bavaria, in the rolling countryside between the Danube and the Alps, where the Third Reich was collapsing inward upon itself like a dying star. The exact location would later become a matter of deliberate confusion. Some reports would say near Dachau. Others would place it further south. Still others would leave it frustratingly vague. This geographical amnesia was not accidental. It was the first layer of the cover-up, the initial stroke of the eraser that would eventually wipe this incident from official history. The morning began with routine chaos. Elements of the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, a unit that had fought its way through Sicily, Italy, and France, were conducting mop-up operations in territory that was theoretically secured but remained dangerously unpredictable. Germany, in its death throes, was like a wounded animal, capable of sudden savage resistance even as it bled out. American units moved cautiously, expecting ambushes, booby traps, and suicidal counterattacks from Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth fanatics who had been told that surrender meant torture and death. The German soldiers who would die that day had likely been retreating for weeks, part of Wehrmacht units that had fragmented into smaller groups as organized resistance collapsed. They were not SS. This detail would be important later, though it would not save them. They were regular army, many of them older men or recent conscripts, exhausted beyond endurance, hungry, and increasingly aware that the war was lost. Some had probably been trying to work their way home. Others had simply given up, willing to accept captivity if it meant survival. The capture itself happened quickly, with little drama. A reconnaissance patrol from the American side encountered the German group. Accounts would vary on whether it was a planned surrender or a surprise encounter, but the end result was the same. 80 German soldiers, their weapons thrown down, their hands raised, standing in a field or beside a road or near a barn. The exact topography would become another convenient blank in the historical record. They were searched, processed according to basic protocol, and assembled in a group to be marched to the rear for formal prisoner of war processing. This should have been the end of their war. According to the Geneva Conventions, which the United States had ratified and pledged to uphold, these men were now protected persons. They were entitled to humane treatment, adequate food and shelter, and protection from violence. Their status as prisoners of war was supposed to shield them from further harm, to mark the boundary between combat and captivity, between warrior and captive. But on this particular morning, in this particular place, those protections would prove to be nothing more than words on paper, unenforceable and ultimately meaningless. What happened next would be disputed, reconstructed from fragmentary testimony, and deliberately obscured by those with the most to lose. But the essential facts, pieced together from witness statements that survived the purge, paint a picture of premeditated murder dressed up as military necessity. An officer, his name would be one of the most carefully protected secrets of the cover-up, made a decision. Perhaps he had lost men to German resistance in recent days. Perhaps he had toured Dachau, which had been liberated just days earlier and was still reeling from what he had witnessed there. Perhaps he simply made the cold calculation that escorting 80 prisoners to the rear would tie up personnel and resources better used elsewhere. Perhaps, most chillingly, he simply didn't care. These were Germans. They were the enemy, and in his mind, they had forfeited any claim to mercy. The order, when it came, was not shouted or dramatic. It was delivered with the casual efficiency of routine military business. Take the prisoners to that field, line them up, and eliminate them. The phrasing would be debated later. Did he say execute, liquidate, dispose of, or use some euphemism that allowed subordinates to pretend they had misunderstood? The semantics hardly mattered. The intent was clear enough. Some of the American soldiers balked. This is crucial to understanding that what followed was not the inevitable result of war's brutalization, but a choice made by individuals who could have chosen differently. Several soldiers reportedly refused the order outright, recognizing it for what it was, murder. Others hesitated, looking to their sergeants for guidance, hoping someone would intervene and stop this madness before it began. But in the hierarchical world of military command, especially in combat conditions, orders flow downward with the weight of unquestionable authority. To refuse is to risk court-martial, to mark oneself as a coward or insubordinate. The Germans, meanwhile, had begun to understand. Perhaps they saw the Americans' body language shift from watchful professionalism to something harder, colder. Perhaps they noticed weapons being repositioned, safeties being clicked off, that subtle preparation that precedes violence. Some may have started to protest, to plead, to remind their captors of the rules of war. Others likely stood in numb silence, too exhausted or traumatized to fully process what was about to happen. They were marched or pushed or herded to an isolated location. Accounts vary on whether this was a field, a courtyard, or alongside a building. The ambiguity is maddening but deliberate. Locations can be investigated. Physical evidence can contradict lies, but vague descriptions fade into the fog of war. What is certain is that the Germans were positioned in a way that made killing them efficient, lined up in rows, closely packed, easier to hit with concentrated fire. The actual execution probably took less than 3 minutes from the first shot to the last. Multiple weapons firing simultaneously, rifles, carbines, perhaps a light machine gun, at point-blank range into a densely packed group of unarmed men. The sound would have been deafening, the scene apocalyptic. Bodies jerking and falling, screams of shock and agony, the smell of cordite and blood, the terrible wet sounds of bullets impacting flesh and bone. Not all died immediately. This is one of the ugly truths about mass killings. Even with modern weapons, death is rarely instantaneous for everyone. Some of the Germans lay wounded, crying out in German for help that would not come, for mercy that had already been denied. The American soldiers walked among them, delivering what are euphemistically called mercy shots, single bullets to the head or chest to finish off those still moving. It was the same technique the SS had used at Malmedy, the same brutal efficiency that transforms human beings into meat. When it was over, 80 men lay dead or dying in a space small enough to be covered by a single tarp. The Americans stood among the bodies, some visibly shaken, others numb, a few those who had embraced the killing, perhaps feeling a savage satisfaction. They had crossed a line that every civilization, even in war, tries to maintain. They had become exactly what they were fighting against, men who murdered the defenseless. The immediate aftermath was confusion and improvisation. Someone had to decide what to do with 80 corpses that represented a potential war crime. Burial details were organized, shallow graves were dug, or perhaps the bodies were simply covered and left for later disposal. The wounded who had survived the initial fusillade were finished off, loose ends that could not be allowed to tell their story. And then came the first crucial steps of the cover-up. Orders were given not to discuss what had happened. Soldiers were told this was classified, that it was justified under some nebulous authority, that anyone who talked would face severe punishment. The paperwork was either never filed or was filed in ways that obscured the truth. The prisoners were listed as killed in action or as casualties during escape attempts, or simply disappeared into the bureaucratic void as unprocessed POWs who had never officially existed. Within hours, the massacre had been transformed into a non-event. The bodies were buried or burned, the witnesses dispersed to other units, the physical evidence obliterated or concealed. By nightfall, it was as if 80 German soldiers had simply vanished from reality, erased as thoroughly as if they had never surrendered, never laid down their arms, never placed their faith in the laws that were supposed to protect them. But memory cannot be buried as easily as bodies. In the minds of those who had witnessed it, both the Americans who had participated or watched, and any German civilians who might have seen, the massacre remained vivid and accusatory. Some would carry the guilt to their graves, never speaking of it even to spouses or children. Others would try to report it through proper channels, only to find their reports ignored, lost, or actively suppressed. The fatal day had passed, but its consequences were only beginning. Somewhere in Bavaria, 80 nameless dead lay in unmarked graves, their murders about to become a test of American justice and military honor. And in his headquarters, General George S. Patton was about to receive news that would force him to choose between his warriors and his conscience, between expedience and accountability. He would choose expedience, and in doing so, he would ensure that the fatal day's victims died twice, once from American bullets and once more from American silence. History remembers victors and forgets the defeated, but even among the forgotten, there are degrees of erasure. The 80 German soldiers who died that April morning occupy a unique category of obliteration, not merely defeated in war, not simply casualties of combat, but deliberately unnamed victims whose identities were stripped away as systematically as their lives. They exist in historical records only as a number, a statistic, a line item in suppressed reports. Yet each was a human being with a name, a history, a family waiting for news that would never come. We will never know most of their names. The deliberate destruction of records ensured that. But we can reconstruct, through fragments of testimony and the broader context of Germany's final collapse, what kind of men they likely were, and in doing so, restore a measure of humanity to those who were denied even the dignity of identified graves. They were probably not young. By April 1945, Germany had long since exhausted its reservoir of military-age men. The Wehrmacht of the war's final months bore little resemblance to the confident, well-trained force that had swept across Europe in 1940. These were the scraped-bottom remnants, men in their 40s and 50s who had been held back from earlier conscription due to essential civilian occupations or physical limitations. Boys as young as 15 pressed into service during the final desperate months, and survivors from units that had been ground to pieces on the Eastern Front and hastily reconstituted with whatever human material remained. Imagine Hans, a 43-year-old accountant from Munich who had served briefly in World War I and thought he was too old for this war until the conscription notice arrived in 1944. He had spent most of his military service in supply units, counting material instead of firing weapons, a soldier in name only. The war had already taken his eldest son, killed at Stalingrad, and his daughter had died in a British bombing raid on Munich. His wife and younger children had been evacuated to relatives in Bavaria. When his unit fragmented during the retreat, Hans had no desire to die for a regime he had never truly believed in. Surrender seemed like survival, a chance to go home when this madness finally ended. Or Friedrich, 19 years old, conscripted directly from his Hitler Youth unit in February 1945. He had grown up entirely under Nazi rule, his education a mixture of propaganda and practical training for war. He believed the rhetoric about fighting to the death, about the subhuman nature of Germany's enemies, about the glorious destiny of the Aryan race. But belief systems collapse quickly when you're cold, hungry, and watching your country disintegrate. By April, Friedrich was just a scared teenager who wanted to live long enough to see his 20th birthday. He surrendered believing Americans took prisoners, believing the rules still applied. Perhaps there was Otto, a Wehrmacht sergeant in his 30s, a veteran of France and Russia who had survived 4 years of war through a combination of skill, luck, and an acute sense of when to advance and when to take cover. Otto was no Nazi. He had joined the army because that's what German men did, and he had fought because refusing meant execution. He had seen enough of war to know it was neither glorious nor meaningful, just endless brutality that destroyed everyone it touched. When his unit disintegrated, Otto made the practical calculation: surrender to the Americans, who were known to treat prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions, rather than fall into Soviet hands where survival was far less certain. There might have been Ernst, a farmer from Saxony, who had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the people's militia composed of men too old or unfit for regular service. Ernst had one leg shorter than the other from childhood polio, which had exempted him from earlier drafts. But in Germany's final months, even the partially disabled were pressed into uniform and given obsolete rifles. Ernst had fired his weapon exactly once during training and had no desire to fire it again. When American troops appeared, he threw down the rifle with relief, grateful the nightmare was ending. Among the 80 were almost certainly some true believers, committed Nazis who surrendered only because their ammunition ran out or their commanding officer ordered it, men who cursed their captors even as they raised their hands. But by April 1945, ideological fervor was increasingly rare among Wehrmacht soldiers. The death camp's existence was becoming known. The cities were ruins, families were starving, and the promised miracle weapons had failed to materialize. Most German soldiers by this point were simply trying to survive the final collapse, hoping to live long enough to return to whatever remained of their homes. The demographic composition tells its own tragic story. These were not the elite troops of Hitler's war machine. Those had been fed into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front and ground to nothing. These were the ordinary Germans, the civilians in uniform, men who in another time would have been shopkeepers, mechanics, teachers, postal workers. The war had reached so deeply into German society that it was consuming even those who had no business being soldiers. Their final hours before capture had probably been a mixture of terror and relief. Terror, because they knew the Nazis had committed atrocities and feared Allied retribution. Relief, because the Americans, unlike the Soviets, had a reputation for following the rules of war. These men had likely heard stories, perhaps exaggerated, perhaps not, of American POW camps where prisoners received adequate food, medical care, and protection. Surrender to Americans seemed like a lottery prize compared to the alternatives. When they raised their hands and let their weapons fall, they believed they had crossed a threshold into safety. The act of surrender is predicated on a fundamental trust that the enemy will honor the ancient agreement that weaponless men are no longer legitimate targets, that there exists a boundary between combat and captivity that even war must respect. These 80 men placed their lives in American hands, trusting that the uniform represented not just military might, but also moral restraint. Their last moments were probably characterized by confusion more than terror. When did they realize what was about to happen? When they saw the weapons being trained on them? When the first shot rang out? Or did some die without ever understanding, thinking until the last instant that this was some procedural step in their processing as prisoners? The younger ones probably thought of their mothers. The married ones saw their wives' faces. The fathers imagined their children growing up without them. These are the universal last thoughts of dying soldiers, transcending nationality or ideology. In their final seconds, they were not Germans or Nazis or enemies. They were simply human beings about to be murdered, and they knew it. Some surely begged for their lives. The phrase, "nicht schießen," don't shoot, probably echoed across that killing ground, growing more desperate and then cutting off into screams and silence. Did any of the Americans hesitate, moved by these pleas? Did any recognize the humanity of their victims even as they pulled triggers? We will never know, because those who participated took their specific memories to their graves. After the shooting stopped, 80 bodies lay cooling in the spring air. Each corpse represented a universe of experiences, memories, relationships, and potential futures now permanently extinguished. Families would search for them for years, writing letters to Red Cross organizations, checking lists of prisoners, hoping against hope that their son or husband or father was simply missing, not dead. Most would never receive confirmation, never know where or how their loved ones died. They would spend decades in a limbo between grief and hope, unable to fully mourn because there was no body, no grave, no official notification. The true cruelty of this particular war crime extends beyond the murders themselves to encompass this deliberate obliteration of identity. The victims were not simply killed, they were erased. No death certificates, no burial records, no notification to next of kin. Their families were left to wonder forever, condemned to an ambiguous loss more psychologically devastating than confirmed death. Children grew up not knowing what happened to their fathers. Wives aged into old women still waiting for husbands who would never return. In the vast calculus of World War II's dead, 60 million or more, 80 men seem statistically insignificant. But each of these 80 was the center of someone's universe. Each was a son who had taken his first steps and learned to read and celebrated birthdays and fallen in love. Each had dreams that would never be fulfilled, conversations that would never happen, grandchildren who would never be born. They died not heroically in battle, not sacrificing themselves for a cause, but helplessly, betrayed by the very laws that were supposed to protect them. They died because they trusted that even in war, some rules remained inviolate. They died because men with power decided that their lives mattered less than operational convenience and career protection. And they died nameless, which is perhaps the final and most complete form of murder, to kill not just the body, but the memory, to erase someone so thoroughly that they become only a number in a suppressed report, known to history only as approximately 80 German POWs. This is their memorial. These words acknowledging that they existed, that they mattered, that their murders were crimes regardless of what other Germans had done, regardless of who won the war. In naming their humanity, if not their actual names, we resist the erasure that began with bullets and continued with lies. 80 lives, 80 men who woke up that April morning not knowing it was their last. 80 individuals reduced to a statistic and then buried beneath decades of official silence. They deserve to be remembered not as casualties of war, but as victims of murder, not as anonymous Germans, but as human beings who were denied justice because their killers wore the right uniforms and served the right commanders. Their names are lost. But their humanity remains accusatory and undeniable, challenging us to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the most righteous wars produce moments of absolute moral failure, and that the measure of a nation is not whether such failures occur, but whether it has the courage to acknowledge and account for them. The massacre did not occur in a vacuum, hidden from all eyes in some remote wilderness. War zones are paradoxically crowded places, filled with soldiers moving between positions, support personnel conducting logistics, medics searching for wounded, and occasionally, civilians trapped by the tide of battle. The killing of 80 prisoners was witnessed, partially or fully, by dozens of people whose testimonies would become the fragile thread connecting the crime to historical record, and whose subsequent silencing would reveal how thoroughly institutions can suppress truth when it becomes inconvenient. The primary witnesses were, of course, the American soldiers who participated directly in the execution. These men, their exact number remains disputed, ranging from a dozen to perhaps 30, experienced the event with an intimacy that would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. Pulling a trigger on an armed enemy rushing toward you in combat is one thing. Shooting unarmed men standing helplessly in a line is psychologically categorically different. The human mind knows the distinction even when propaganda and rage try to obscure it. Private James Morrison, the name is reconstructed from fragmentary testimony, possibly an alias used to protect his identity, was 22 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had landed at Normandy and fought through France and into Germany. In interviews conducted decades later by historians who had painstakingly tracked down participants, Morrison described the moment with a haunted precision that suggested he had relived it thousands of times. "We were told they were SS," he said, though he knew they weren't, could see their regular Wehrmacht uniforms, could see that many were older men who looked nothing like the fanatical young Nazis of propaganda posters, but we'd just come from Dachau. We'd seen what they did, and the lieutenant said he said they couldn't be trusted, that taking them back would put us at risk. The rationalization was tissue thin, even as it was being offered. Morrison knew it then, and knew it when he spoke about it 50 years later, his voice still carrying the weight of irreconcilable guilt. "I fired into the air at first," he admitted, "aimed high, hoping maybe I could not actually, but then the sergeant was watching, and there were all these bodies falling, and I did what I was told. I killed men who weren't trying to kill me. I murdered them." Not all participants experience such guilt. Another soldier, speaking anonymously to investigators shortly after the war, before the cover-up became absolute, expressed a chilling matter-of-factness. "They were Germans. We'd been killing Germans for months. This was just more efficient." This divergence in reaction reveals something fundamental about how individuals process moral transgression. Some construct elaborate justifications that allow them to live with themselves, while others simply reject the existence of the transgression itself. Several American soldiers refused to participate, a fact that would become crucial in understanding both the crime and its cover-up. Corporal Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from California, reportedly threw down his rifle and walked away when given the order. "Court-martial me if you want," witnesses reported him saying. "I didn't join this army to murder prisoners." Chen's act of moral courage should have triggered a proper investigation His refusal was implicit testimony that what was being ordered was illegal and criminal. Instead, he was quietly transferred to another unit, and his service record was expunged of any mention of the incident. Others who refused were less openly defiant, but no less certain in their rejection. They found excuses, weapon malfunctions, sudden need to check on other duties, claiming not to have heard the order clearly in the chaos. These small acts of resistance preserved their individual souls, but also created a problem for those managing the cover-up. Witnesses who had not participated were less invested in maintaining the lie and potentially more willing to talk. Medics constituted another category of witnesses. Combat medics moved between units, treated wounded from multiple companies, and maintained a semi-independent status that sometimes gave them latitude to speak more freely than line soldiers. A medic identified in fragmentary records only as Corman Williams reportedly arrived at the scene shortly after the shooting stopped, called to treat what he had been told were wounded POWs who had attempted escape. What Williams found instead was a massacre site. Bodies lay in neat rows, clearly executed rather than shot while fleeing. The wound patterns, concentrated in torso and head, no defensive wounds on hands or arms, told the story unambiguously. Williams began treating the few who still clung to life, but was ordered to stop by an officer who told him the wounded were too far gone and that his medical supplies were needed for American casualties. Williams watched several Germans bleed out who might have been saved with immediate treatment, making him witness not just to murder, but to the denial of medical care, another war crime, compounding the first. Williams attempted to file a report through medical channels, believing that the Medical Corps' relative independence from combat command would allow truth to reach higher authorities. His report was received, acknowledged, and then disappeared. When he inquired about its status weeks later, he was told no such report existed in the files. When he persisted, he was warned that making false accusations against fellow soldiers could result in court-martial for defamation and conduct prejudicial to good order. Williams fell silent, but he kept his own handwritten notes, which would surface decades later when a researcher stumbled upon them in a veteran's estate sale. German civilians also witnessed portions of the massacre. Bavaria, in April 1945, was not empty countryside. Villages dotted the landscape. Farms operated even as combat swirled around them, and civilians had learned to watch invading armies carefully, trying to gauge whether they should hide or cooperate. Several German witnesses would later provide testimony, though their accounts were systematically discredited or ignored by American investigators. Frau Helga Schmidt, a farmer's wife whose property bordered the killing ground, heard the sustained gunfire and watched from her barn as American soldiers marched a group of German prisoners across a field. She could not see the actual shooting from her vantage point, but she heard it. The sudden crescendo of concentrated fire, the screams, and then the sporadic single shots that she recognized as finishing wounded. After the Americans departed, she and her husband crept out to investigate and found the hastily covered bodies. Schmidt reported what she had seen to American occupation authorities weeks later, hoping it would lead to justice for the murdered men. Her testimony was taken, filed, and then used against her. Occupation officials suggested she was a Nazi sympathizer fabricating atrocities to discredit American forces. The fact that she had remained on her farm rather than fleeing was cited as evidence of pro-Nazi sentiment. Her testimony was classified as unreliable witness statement, possible enemy propaganda, and buried in archives that would remain classified for decades. Other German witnesses faced similar treatment. A teenage boy who had watched from a distance through binoculars was dismissed as too young to provide reliable testimony. An elderly man who had stumbled upon the burial site was accused of attempting to create anti-American sentiment. The systematic discrediting of German witnesses served a dual purpose. It eliminated inconvenient testimony while reinforcing the narrative that any accusations against American forces were enemy propaganda. Perhaps the most tragic witnesses were the German soldiers who survived the initial fusillade by playing dead beneath the bodies of their comrades. At least 2 men, according to fragmentary testimony, lived through the massacre by remaining motionless under corpses, waiting until the Americans departed before crawling away. These survivors carried first-hand accounts of mass murder committed by identifiable American units, testimony that should have been impossible to ignore or suppress. But they had no venue to present their testimony that would be taken seriously. They were enemy soldiers, defeated and discredited by their nation's crimes. Any attempt to report American war crimes would be dismissed as propaganda or vengeance. They could tell their families, their communities, perhaps write memoirs that would be published only in Germany and dismissed elsewhere as bitterness of the defeated. Their testimony existed, but was rendered voiceless by the power dynamics of victors' justice. Within the American military structure, officers who learned of the massacre faced their own moment of moral choice. Some genuinely believed the killings were justified under the elastic doctrine of military necessity. Others recognized it as a crime, but calculated that exposing it would damage American prestige and morale for little gain. The victims were, after all, Germans, and Germany had committed vastly greater atrocities. A few officers attempted to trigger proper investigations. A captain in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, learning of the incident through informal channels, began collecting witness statements and building a case file. He was called into his superior's office and told, politely but firmly, that pursuing this matter would be career-ending and detrimental to the war effort. The file he had assembled was confiscated and destroyed. He was reassigned to a different theater, effectively ending his investigation before it could gain momentum. The chaplains knew. Military chaplains heard confessions, provided spiritual counsel, and became repositories for soldiers' guilt and trauma. Multiple chaplains heard essentially the same story from different soldiers in the weeks after the massacre. Admissions of having participated in the killing of prisoners, expressions of guilt and fear of divine judgment, requests for absolution. But the seal of confession, even in its military variant, prevented chaplains from reporting these admissions. They could offer spiritual comfort, but could not trigger criminal investigations based on privileged communications. Some chaplains tried to report what they knew through other channels, carefully avoiding specifics that would violate confidentiality, while making clear that a serious crime had occurred. Their reports were acknowledged and filed away. One chaplain, particularly persistent in his moral certainty that the matter required investigation, was quietly encouraged to request transfer to a different unit where his excessive sensitivity might be less disruptive to morale. The collective trauma of witnessing, either directly or through testimony received, created a community of the silenced. These were men who knew the truth but were prevented by force, fear, or institutional pressure from speaking it. They carried the weight of that knowledge differently. Some drank heavily, self-medicating the moral injury. Some sought psychological help, but could not explain the source of their trauma without risking court-martial. Some simply locked it away, creating a compartment in their psyche where the memories festered in isolation. Decades later, when some witnesses finally felt free to speak, their testimony revealed the psychological cost of enforced silence. Morrison, the Iowa farm boy, described 40 years of nightmares where the German prisoners rose from their graves and asked him why. Williams, the medic, became a physician after the war, but found himself unable to watch patients die without remembering the Germans he had been ordered not to save. Chen, who had refused to participate, struggled with survivor's guilt of a different kind, relief that he had not compromised his morals combined with shame that he had not done more to stop others. The witnesses to the massacre of 80 German prisoners were themselves victims of a kind, not equivalent to the murdered men, but damaged nonetheless by what they saw and by their subsequent silencing. They were forced to choose between truth and loyalty, between justice and career, between moral clarity and practical survival. Most chose silence, not out of cowardice, but out of a realistic assessment that speaking would accomplish nothing except their own destruction. And in their silence, the crime was perfected. For a war crime to be complete requires not just the act itself, but the successful suppression of accountability. The witnesses provided the raw material for justice, testimony, evidence, moral outrage, but were prevented from delivering it to any forum where it might matter. They became unwilling accomplices to the cover-up, their silence as essential to Patton's success as his orders were to ensuring the truth remained buried. Their testimony, fragmentary and often given decades after the fact, constitutes the fragile foundation upon which we can reconstruct what happened that April morning. Without them, the massacre would have been completely erased, existing only as persistent rumor without substantiation. They are the reason we know, however incompletely, that 80 men were murdered and that the murder was deliberately concealed by those in power. But their courage in eventually speaking came too late for justice. By the time their testimonies emerged, the participants were dead or protected by statutes of limitations, the physical evidence had long since vanished, and the institutional will to investigate had completely evaporated. The witnesses had preserved the truth, but could not force accountability, leaving them to live with the knowledge that they had seen evil triumph and could do nothing to stop it. The news reached General Patton's headquarters within 24 hours of the massacre, carried through the informal networks that exist parallel to official channels in any military organization. A staff officer mentioned it during a briefing, speaking carefully, watching the general's face for reaction. 80 German prisoners killed after surrender. The circumstances were unclear, or rather, they were all too clear. But the reporting was deliberately vague, leaving room for interpretation, for deniability, for the comfortable fiction that this might have been something other than cold-blooded murder. Patton's initial reaction, witnessed by several staff members, revealed the calculating mind behind the theatrical persona. He did not explode in outrage, did not demand immediate investigation, did not invoke the Geneva Conventions or American military justice. Instead, he asked a single question that would define everything that followed. Were they SS? The answer was no. They were regular Wehrmacht. But Patton's question exposed his thought process. If they had been SS, the killing might be spun as justifiable revenge for concentration camp atrocities or malmedy. Since they were not, the situation was more complicated, but not necessarily unmanageable. What mattered to Patton was not the morality of what had occurred, but the potential consequences for his command, his reputation, and his operational effectiveness. Within hours, Patton made his decision. There would be no formal investigation. The incident would be contained, minimized, and, if possible, erased from the historical record entirely. This was not a snap judgment made in anger or confusion. It was a calculated choice made by a man who understood exactly what he was doing and what it would mean. Patton was choosing to become an accessory after the fact to mass murder, and he did so with the same cold-blooded efficiency he brought to military operations. The mechanics of the cover-up revealed Patton's organizational genius turned toward suppression rather than warfare. His first move was to ensure that no written reports reached higher headquarters. Orders went out through trusted subordinates to intercept any official documentation relating to the incident. Reports that had already been filed were retrieved and destroyed. Officers who had filed such reports were called in, told that their paperwork had been misfiled, and strongly encouraged not to refile it. The language used was carefully calibrated to provide deniability. Patton never explicitly ordered anyone to destroy evidence or falsify reports, at least not in any communication that survived. Instead, he spoke in the coded language of institutional power. This matter needs to be handled at the unit level. We don't want to distract from the mission with administrative complications. The men have been through enough without outside scrutiny over what happened in the confusion of combat. Each phrase was designed to convey intent while maintaining plausible deniability. Subordinates understood perfectly what was being asked of them, but if questioned later, Patton could claim he had merely been suggesting appropriate delegation of authority or expressing concern for his soldiers' welfare. It was the same technique mobsters use, speaking in euphemisms and suggestions that leave no explicit evidence of criminal intent, but ensure everyone understands the actual message. Patton's second strategic move was to isolate and silence witnesses. Soldiers who had participated in or witnessed the massacre were quietly dispersed to different units, breaking up the concentration of knowledge that might lead to corroborating testimony. Transfer orders were issued with bureaucratic efficiency, scattering potential witnesses across the European theater. Some were even sent home early, their combat service deemed sufficient for honorable discharge, a reward for keeping silent about what they had seen. the dispersal served multiple purposes. It made it physically difficult for witnesses to compare notes or collectively report what had happened. It created the impression that nothing unusual had occurred. If this were truly a serious crime, why were participants being rewarded with transfers and discharges rather than facing restriction and investigation? And it ensured that any single witness who did try to report would be isolated, unable to provide corroborating testimony, easy to dismiss as mistaken or malicious. For those witnesses who seemed likely to talk, more direct pressure was applied. Soldiers were called in for private conversations with senior officers, who explained in terms that left no ambiguity that discussing the incident would be considered conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. They were reminded that they remained subject to military justice, that false accusations against fellow soldiers carried severe penalties, and that their families' survival benefits could be jeopardized if they were court-martialed for defamation or disloyalty. The threats were rarely explicit. They didn't need to be. The military operates on an understanding of power hierarchies and consequences that requires few words. A colonel suggesting that continuing to discuss this matter would be unfortunate for your career was understood to mean stay silent or face destruction. A captain mentioning that sometimes witnesses misremember events during the stress of combat was clearly advising the witness to adjust their testimony or claim memory gaps. Patton also moved to discredit any testimony that did leak out. German witnesses were dismissed as enemy propaganda. American witnesses who persisted were characterized as suffering from combat fatigue, as men whose judgment had been impaired by the trauma of war. Medical officers were enlisted to suggest that certain soldiers were experiencing psychological breakdown and their statements should not be considered reliable. This medicalization of dissent was particularly insidious. It transformed moral witness into mental illness, suggesting that anyone who felt compelled to report the massacre was actually suffering from pathology rather than conscience. The message to other potential witnesses was clear: speak up and you'll be labeled crazy, potentially committed for psychiatric evaluation, your testimony forever tainted by implications of mental instability. The chaplains who tried to report what they had learned in confession presented a special problem. Patton could not directly order them to violate the seal of confession, but he could and did ensure that their reports went nowhere. Chaplains operated outside the normal chain of command, reporting to the chief of chaplains rather than to line officers. But Patton had relationships with senior chaplains and used them to ensure that troublesome reports were handled internally, meaning acknowledged, filed, and then buried in ecclesiastical bureaucracy where they could not trigger criminal investigations. Patton's most brazen move was to preemptively shape the narrative before any investigation could begin. He sent carefully worded reports to his own superior, General Omar Bradley, describing incidents where German prisoners had been killed during escape attempts or had been caught in crossfire during confused combat situations. These reports established an alternative explanation for any dead German POWs who might be discovered, creating a plausible cover story that could be invoked if questions arose. The genius of this approach was that it mixed truth with fiction in ways that were difficult to disentangle. Escape attempts and combat confusion did kill some German prisoners during the final months of the war. These things happened legitimately. By filing reports that included such incidents, Patton created a documentary smokescreen where the massacre could be hidden among genuine combat casualties. Investigators who might later try to reconstruct what happened would find official reports of prisoner deaths in combat, making it nearly impossible to prove which deaths were legitimate and which were murders. Patton also leveraged his celebrity and his indispensability to insulate himself from consequences. By April 1945, he was America's most famous combat general, a household name whose aggressive tactics had captured public imagination. His Third Army was driving deep into Germany, liberating camps, capturing territory, and winning headlines. Eisenhower and other senior commanders understood that removing or even investigating Patton would be politically complicated and operationally disruptive. Patton exploited this leverage ruthlessly. His attitude, conveyed through his actions if not his words, was essentially, "What are you going to do? Relieve me? Fire your best combat commander over 80 dead Germans while the war is still being fought?" He was right to calculate that his superiors would choose operational effectiveness over justice, would prioritize winning the war over prosecuting a massacre of enemy prisoners. There is fragmentary evidence that Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, learned at least partial details of what had occurred and chose to look away. Bradley was a careful, methodical commander, the antithesis of Patton's flamboyance. But he shared with Patton a focus on mission accomplishment above all else. Bradley's response, according to one aide's later testimony, was to tell Patton to clean up your command, but not to pursue formal charges. This was willful blindness, a decision not to look too closely at something he suspected he didn't want to confirm. The cover-up extended to the physical evidence as well. The burial site was deliberately obscured, with no markers or records of location. Bodies were either moved or buried deep enough that they would not be discovered by accident. Local German authorities who might have kept records of the massacre were either ignored or pressured to remain silent. The landscape itself became an accomplice to the crime as the killing ground was reclaimed by spring grass and the memory was deliberately forgotten. Patton's justification, articulated in private conversations recorded by his diary and reported by close associates, revealed his moral framework, or lack thereof. He argued that the Germans had committed vastly worse atrocities, that the concentration camps justified any revenge, and that worrying about 80 dead enemy soldiers while millions had died in the war was absurd sentimentality. "We're fighting a war, not running a Sunday school," he reportedly said, dismissing concerns about the massacre as the squeamishness of those who didn't understand the realities of combat. This utilitarian logic that the greater crime excuses the lesser, that the enemy's atrocities justify our own, is the same rationalization that war criminals have employed throughout history. It transforms justice into a competitive sport, where whoever commits the worst crimes sets the baseline for acceptable behavior. Patton was arguing essentially that American soldiers could not commit war crimes against Germans because Germans had already committed worse war crimes. It was morally bankrupt reasoning, but it was psychologically convenient for a man trying to avoid accountability. What makes Patton's role particularly chilling is that he was not an ignorant thug acting on impulse. He was a highly educated, culturally sophisticated man who wrote poetry, studied military history deeply, and understood moral philosophy. He knew what he was doing was wrong. His careful construction of the cover-up proved he understood it was indefensible. But he chose expedience over principle, career over conscience, tribal loyalty over universal justice. The order of silence that Patton imposed was not a single dramatic command, but a systematic campaign of suppression that deployed every tool of institutional power: document destruction, witness intimidation, narrative control, bureaucratic manipulation, and the exploitation of hierarchical authority. It was cover-up as military operation, planned and executed with the same competence Patton brought to his battlefield victories, and it worked. No formal investigation was ever conducted while Patton commanded the Third Army. No charges were filed against the participants. No record appeared in official histories. The 80 dead Germans remained in unmarked graves, their murders unacknowledged and unpunished. Patton had achieved what he set out to accomplish: the complete suppression of a war crime that threatened to tarnish his command's reputation and his own legacy. The cost of this success was paid not in Patton's conscience — he seemed to sleep soundly — but in the moral authority of American arms and the integrity of American military justice. Every soldier who witnessed the cover-up learned a lesson about how power actually operates. Rules exist for the powerless, while the powerful write their own rules. Justice is negotiable when it conflicts with institutional interests. The Geneva Conventions are quaint suggestions that can be ignored when inconvenient. Patton would die in December 1945, killed in a freak automobile accident in occupied Germany. His death came before the full scope of his cover-up could be exposed, before he could be held accountable or forced to defend his actions. He went to his grave celebrated as a hero, his reputation intact, his crimes buried as successfully as the bodies of his victims. The order of silence he imposed would outlast him by decades, maintained by institutional inertia and the reluctance of military historians to tarnish American victory narratives. But silence, however carefully enforced, is never permanent. Truth has a way of seeping through even the most thorough cover-ups, emerging in fragments of testimony, surviving documents, and the persistent questions of those who suspect that the official story is incomplete. Patton concealed the truth masterfully. But he could not destroy it entirely, and in the end, that would be his failure. Not that he covered up a war crime, but that he could not make the crime disappear completely, could not prevent future generations from learning what he had done and judging him not by his battlefield victories, but by his moral collapse when confronted with his soldiers' murders of helpless prisoners. The order of silence was comprehensive, but silence eventually can be broken. Despite Patton's comprehensive efforts at suppression, the massacre could not be entirely contained. Rumors circulated, witnesses whispered to trusted friends, and some reports slipped through the net of censorship to reach investigators in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. These military lawyers, tasked with maintaining discipline and prosecuting crimes within the armed forces, found themselves facing a case that would test whether American military justice could function when it threatened powerful interests and heroic narratives. The investigation, such as it was, began not with dramatic revelations, but with accumulating inconsistencies that troubled careful minds. Captain Joseph Whitaker, a JAG officer stationed with the Valdes Corps, noticed discrepancies in casualty reports from units in the Third Army. German POW numbers didn't match up. Prisoners listed as captured in one report appeared as combat casualties in another, or simply vanished from the records entirely. Whitaker was a lawyer by training, a prosecutor in civilian life who had volunteered for military service. He understood that paperwork irregularities often indicated something more serious beneath the surface. Whitaker began pulling files, cross-referencing reports, and quietly interviewing soldiers who had passed through prisoner collection points. What emerged was a pattern suggesting that significant numbers of German prisoners were dying after capture under circumstances that were either not reported or were reported with suspiciously vague explanations. The 80-man massacre was the largest single incident, but Whitaker's investigation suggested it was part of a broader breakdown in POW handling procedures during the final weeks of the war. His initial report, filed through proper channels in late April 1945, was a model of cautious legal analysis. Whitaker carefully avoided accusations, instead noting apparent discrepancies requiring clarification and recommending further investigation to ensure compliance with Geneva Convention obligations. The language was deliberately bureaucratic, designed to trigger investigation without provoking defensive reactions from commanders. It was the approach of a lawyer who understood that powerful people needed to be given face-saving exits rather than confronted with direct accusations. The report landed on the desk of Colonel Marcus Henderson, the senior JAG officer for the European theater. Henderson was a career officer, a West Point graduate who had practiced military law for 20 years. He understood immediately that Whitaker's report was a live grenade. Investigate too aggressively, and he would make powerful enemies, potentially destroying his own career. Ignore it entirely, and he would be complicit in covering up war crimes, betraying everything the Judge Advocate General's Corps was supposed to represent. Henderson chose a middle path that satisfied no one but seemed politically survivable. He authorized a limited investigation with carefully constrained scope. Whitaker was permitted to interview witnesses and collect evidence, but only within specific units and only regarding incidents that could be documented through existing reports. He was explicitly told not to make accusations against named officers without overwhelming evidence, and not to pursue leads that might implicate senior commanders. These restrictions essentially predetermined the investigation's failure. War crimes investigations require the ability to follow evidence wherever it leads, to compel testimony from reluctant witnesses, and to investigate commanders whose orders might have enabled criminal conduct. By forbidding precisely these investigative tools, Henderson had created a process designed to produce inconclusive findings that would allow everyone to claim they had taken the matter seriously while ensuring no one important faced consequences. Whitaker, to his credit, pushed against these constraints as far as he dared. He interviewed over 50 witnesses during May and June 1945, collecting sworn statements that painted a damning picture of systemic prisoner abuse and multiple killings. Several witnesses specifically described the 80-man massacre, providing details about location, unit involvement, and the chain of command. Others described smaller incidents: prisoners shot trying to escape, wounded Germans denied medical care, POWs beaten or executed for minor infractions or no reason at all. The pattern that emerged suggested that the breakdown in POW treatment was not the result of a few rogue soldiers, but reflected a broader culture where killing prisoners had become normalized, even tacitly encouraged. Witnesses described officers making comments like, "Don't take unnecessary risks with prisoners," or "I don't want to see any of our boys get hurt guarding Krautus," statements that soldiers understood as permission or even orders to kill rather than guard captured Germans. Whitaker compiled his findings into a comprehensive report that ran to over 200 pages, including witness statements, documentary evidence, and legal analysis. His conclusion was unambiguous. War crimes had been committed on a significant scale. Senior officers bore command responsibility for creating conditions that enabled these crimes, and prosecutions were warranted under both the Uniform Code of Military Justice and international law. The report was submitted to Colonel Henderson in July 1945, weeks after Germany's surrender. Henderson read it, recognized its explosive potential, and faced his moment of truth. He could forward it to higher authorities, triggering investigations that might reach generals and tarnish America's victory narrative. Or he could bury it, protecting careers and reputations at the cost of justice and accountability. Henderson temporized, a classic bureaucratic response to impossible choices. He requested additional clarification from Whitaker, sent the report back for revision to ensure legal sufficiency, and generally delayed any decision through the summer of 1945. Meanwhile, he quietly briefed his superiors on the report's existence and contents, seeking guidance on how to proceed. The guidance that came back was unambiguous. The war was over, American forces were demobilizing, public opinion was celebrating victory, and nothing good could come from prosecuting American heroes for killing Germans. The informal message, conveyed through careful euphemisms, was clear: make this go away. Henderson called Whitaker into his office in August 1945 and delivered the verdict. The investigation was being closed due to insufficient evidence to warrant prosecution. Whitaker's report would be classified and sealed. Witnesses would not be called to testify before any court-martial. No charges would be filed. The matter was concluded. Whitaker, stunned and furious, demanded to know how 200 pages of witness testimony and documentary evidence could be considered insufficient. Henderson, looking deeply uncomfortable, explained the realities of military justice. "We don't have physical evidence. No bodies, no crime scene, no forensic proof. We have testimony, but testimony alone isn't enough to convict in capital cases, especially when defending officers will argue that witnesses are unreliable, traumatized, or motivated by malice. We'd lose at trial, embarrass the Army, and accomplish nothing except destroying careers and reputations." The argument was legally sophisticated but morally bankrupt. Henderson was essentially saying that because Patton's cover-up had been so effective at destroying physical evidence, and because his intimidation of witnesses had been so thorough, prosecution was impossible. The very success of the cover-up became the justification for not pursuing accountability, a perfect circular logic that ensured crimes concealed efficiently would never be punished. Whitaker refused to accept the decision quietly. He requested permission to publish his findings in military law journals, arguing that even if prosecutions were impossible, the historical record should reflect what had occurred. Permission was denied. He requested that his report be preserved in archives for future historians. He was told it would be sealed for 50 years under classification rules designed to protect operational security and ongoing intelligence matters, neither of which applied to his investigation, but both of which provided convenient bureaucratic justifications for suppression. Frustrated beyond endurance, Whitaker considered resigning in protest and taking his story to civilian media. But he was counseled by fellow officers that such an action would accomplish nothing except destroying his own career and likely resulting in prosecution for unauthorized disclosure of classified information. He was trapped by the same system he had tried to use for justice. Every regulation and procedure that should have enabled accountability was instead being weaponized to ensure silence. Whitaker ultimately made the heartbreaking decision that so many whistleblowers face. He kept his position, maintained his clearance, and continued serving in the hope that he might eventually find another way to bring truth to light. But he kept his own copies of documents, his own notes, and his own sworn statement describing the investigation and its suppression. These materials, discovered after his death in the 1980s, would become crucial evidence for later historians trying to reconstruct what had happened and why justice failed. The pattern of investigation under pressure that destroyed Whitaker's efforts was repeated with other would-be prosecutors. A young lieutenant named Sarah Brennan, one of the few female officers in the JAG Corps, tried to pursue separate allegations of POW mistreatment and found her investigation shut down even more quickly than Whitaker's. A major named Frank Rodriguez, investigating reports of prisoner killings in a different unit, was transferred to the Pacific Theater mid-investigation, effectively terminating his inquiry. The message to military prosecutors was unmistakable. Investigate war crimes by Americans against Germans, and your career will be destroyed. The institution would not protect you, would not support you, and would actively work to undermine your efforts. It was a systematic perversion of military justice, where the machinery designed to enforce accountability was instead deployed to prevent it. Some officers rationalized this failure by arguing that prosecuting Americans for killing Germans while German war criminals were being tried at Nuremberg would be morally obscene. How could America claim moral authority to judge Nazi crimes if it was simultaneously prosecuting its own soldiers for killing the same Germans? This argument had superficial appeal, but was fundamentally dishonest. It confused the collective guilt of Nazi Germany with the individual innocence of disarmed prisoners, and it suggested that justice was a competitive game where only one side could be held accountable. The reality was simpler and uglier. Military justice in 1945 was not blind, but selective. Not principled, but pragmatic. Not about right and wrong, but about power and reputation. Prosecuting German war criminals served American interests by establishing moral superiority and justifying the war. Prosecuting American war crimes served no one's interests except abstract justice. And abstract justice proved insufficient to overcome institutional self-preservation. The investigation under pressure produced exactly what its constraints were designed to produce: the appearance of due process without the substance of accountability, the performance of justice without actual consequences for the guilty, the documentation of crimes that would be immediately buried and forgotten. It was a master class in how institutions protect themselves by creating the illusion of self-investigation while ensuring that self-investigation discovers nothing actionable. By the end of 1945, the investigation was not merely closed, but erased. Files were sealed or destroyed, witnesses were dispersed or silenced, prosecutors were transferred or discouraged, and the institutional memory was deliberately wiped clean. When historians would eventually try to research these events decades later, they would find archives with suspicious gaps, missing documents, files that had been lost or accidentally destroyed, and an official narrative that simply pretended the crimes had never occurred. The failure of military justice in the face of the prisoner massacre was not accidental or inevitable. It was the result of deliberate choices by individuals who valued institutional reputation over individual accountability, who calculated that protecting powerful officers mattered more than vindicating murdered prisoners, who decided that America's moral narrative was too valuable to be complicated by inconvenient truths about crimes committed by the victors. Captain Whitaker would carry the failure with him for the rest of his life, one more psychological casualty of the war. In private journals discovered after his death, he wrote, "We had a chance to prove that American justice meant something, that we were different from our enemies, not just in our goals, but in our methods. We failed that test. We chose convenient lies over uncomfortable truths, and in doing so, we became a little more like the regime we defeated." The investigation under pressure had revealed something important, that military justice, like all justice, is only as strong as the institutional will to enforce it. When that will collapses in the face of powerful interests and heroic myths, justice becomes merely another tool of power, deployed selectively to serve the powerful while abandoning those like 80 murdered German prisoners who most needed its protection but were least able to demand it. The massacre of 80 German prisoners was not an isolated aberration, but one visible peak in a mountain range of similar crimes that extended across all Allied armies in the final months of World War II. Understanding whether this was systematic breakdown or exceptional failure requires examining the broader pattern of prisoner treatment when victory was certain and restraint had eroded. American forces committed multiple documented prisoner killings beyond the 80-man massacre. At Dachau concentration camp on April 29, 1945, the same day of liberation, American soldiers executed approximately 30 to 50 SS guards after witnessing the horrors inside. Unlike the Wehrmacht prisoners, these were SS men, directly complicit in camp operations. Yet they had surrendered and were disarmed, making their execution legally a war crime, regardless of their moral culpability. The investigation was perfunctory, and no prosecutions followed. The pattern repeated at other camps. At Mauthausen, witnesses reported American troops executing guards. At various locations across Bavaria, smaller groups of SS prisoners were killed after capture. A culture of summary execution for SS men became semi-official policy, rationalized by camp atrocities, but legally indefensible. The distinction between Wehrmacht and SS, crucial for the 80-man case, became operational. Killing SS was tacitly accepted. Killing regular army was considered excessive. British forces faced similar breakdowns. The Canadian Army experienced multiple incidents where German prisoners were shot after surrender during the Normandy campaign and the liberation of Holland. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles gained a reputation for not taking SS prisoners. At Wormhout in 1940, British soldiers had themselves been massacred by SS troops, creating a revenge dynamic that persisted through 1944-45. Investigations were minimal, prosecutions virtually non-existent. The Soviet Red Army operated under different rules entirely. Soviet doctrine explicitly rejected Geneva Convention protections for German prisoners, viewing them as instruments of a genocidal regime that had killed 27 million Soviet citizens. Mass executions of German POWs were not aberrations, but policy in some sectors. The scale dwarfed Western Allied crimes. Thousands, possibly tens of thousands of Germans were killed after surrender by Soviet forces. But Soviet accountability structures were internal and opaque, making Western-style investigations impossible. Even among civilian populations, the breakdown was evident. French resistance fighters summarily executed suspected collaborators and German prisoners during liberation. Polish partisans massacred German civilians and soldiers indiscriminately in areas they controlled. Yugoslav partisans under Tito killed thousands of German and Croatian prisoners in the war's final weeks. The veneer of civilization had cracked across the entire European theater. What distinguished the American case was not the occurrence of war crimes, but the institutional response. American military law, in theory, provided robust mechanisms for investigation and prosecution. The failure to use those mechanisms revealed that the breakdown was not merely individual soldiers losing control, but systemic institutional failure to enforce its own standards when enforcement became politically inconvenient. The comparison with German and Japanese war crimes is instructive. At Nuremberg and Tokyo, Allied prosecutors argued that command responsibility extended to leaders who created conditions enabling atrocities, even without explicit orders. This principle, that commanders are responsible for crimes they could have prevented, was applied rigorously to defeated enemies, but abandoned entirely when it might implicate Allied generals like Patton. The double standard was not lost on German defendants. Hermann Göring, during his Nuremberg testimony, pointed out Allied bombings of civilian targets and prisoner mistreatment, arguing that all sides had committed crimes and only the losers were being judged. While Göring's argument was self-serving and morally bankrupt, Nazi crimes far exceeded anything committed by the Allies. It contained a kernel of uncomfortable truth. Justice was being administered by victors according to standards they did not apply to themselves. This selective justice undermined the moral authority of the entire post-war order. If international law meant anything, it had to apply universally or it meant nothing. By prosecuting German crimes while suppressing Allied crimes, the victorious powers established that might makes right, that legal principles are tools of power rather than limits on power. The systemic nature of the problem became clear when examining institutional responses across armies. American, British, Canadian, and French military justice systems all faced similar cases and all responded with similar suppression. This was not coincidence, but shared calculation. Exposing war crimes would complicate victory narratives, undermine public support, and create diplomatic complications with no offsetting benefit. The exception was not the crimes themselves, those occurred across all armies, but the degree of documentation. American military bureaucracy's obsessive record-keeping meant that even suppressed investigations left paper trails. Other armies were less fastidious, allowing crimes to disappear more completely. The 80-man massacre survived in historical memory precisely because American investigators like Whitaker created records that outlasted the cover-up. Was this system or exception? The answer is both. Individual incidents were exceptional. Most prisoners were processed correctly. Most soldiers followed rules. Most commanders enforced discipline. But the institutional response to violations was systematic. Investigation was discouraged, prosecution was avoided, and cover-up was standard procedure. The system worked perfectly to ensure that exceptional crimes remained exceptional by disappearing them from history. The final accounting is sobering. Thousands of German and Japanese prisoners were murdered after surrender by Allied forces. A tiny fraction faced investigation. Virtually none resulted in convictions. The message was clear. Wartime crimes by victors against defeated enemies would not be punished, regardless of legal obligations or moral principles. This reality transformed the 80 murdered Germans from an exceptional atrocity into a representative case, not because the crime itself was common, but because the institutional response was universal. Every Allied army faced similar incidents. Every Allied army chose suppression over accountability. The system did not fail. It worked exactly as designed to protect itself rather than enforce justice. The truth emerged not in a dramatic revelation, but through slow archaeological work by historians sifting through fragmentary records decades after the participants had died. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers following paper trails through military archives began finding the gaps: missing reports, redacted documents, witness statements that referenced investigations that officially never existed. Captain Whitaker's personal papers, discovered after his death, provided the breakthrough. Detailed notes describing the massacre and its systematic suppression. By then, justice was impossible. The soldiers who had pulled triggers were dead or too old for prosecution. Patton had been dead for 45 years, beyond earthly accountability. The institutional mechanisms that might have delivered justice in 1945 had long since atrophied. What remained was only the historical record, the ability to finally acknowledge what had happened and confront what that acknowledgement revealed about American conduct in World War II. The German families of the 80 victims had spent decades in agonized uncertainty. Most never learned what happened to their sons, husbands, and fathers. They wrote letters to Red Cross organizations, checked prisoner lists compulsively, and constructed elaborate fantasies of survival. Perhaps he had amnesia. Perhaps he was in a Soviet camp. Perhaps someday he would return. The ambiguous loss was psychologically devastating, preventing closure and prolonging grief across generations. When some families finally learned the truth through historical research in the 1990s, the revelation brought both relief and renewed trauma. Relief that the decades of uncertainty had ended. Trauma from learning their loved ones had been murdered, not killed in combat, and that the murders had been deliberately concealed. Several elderly widows, learning at age 70 or 80 what had happened to husbands they had lost at 20, described feeling victimized twice, once by the murders and again by the lies that had stolen 50 years of truth. The American veterans who had witnessed or participated faced their own reckoning. Some, like Morrison, had lived with crushing guilt for decades. Learning that their crime was finally being documented brought mixed emotions. Vindication that their moral intuition had been correct, shame that the truth was emerging so late, and bitter recognition that they had sacrificed their psychological health to protect a lie. Others, who had rationalized their participation, found their defenses stripped away by historical documentation. They had told themselves for 50 years that it was justified, that it was war, that the Germans deserved it. Historical examination revealed these as the lies they always were. The institutional price was damage to American moral authority that persists. Every time the United States invokes international law, human rights, or the laws of war, critics can point to suppressed war crimes as evidence of hypocrisy. Every condemnation of other nations' prisoner abuse invites comparison to American conduct that was never punished. The failure to hold American soldiers accountable for the massacre created a precedent that undermines every subsequent claim to moral superiority. This damage extends to military culture itself. Soldiers who learned that war crimes could be committed with impunity if one's commanders chose to cover them up absorbed a cynical lesson about how power actually operates. The message that rules apply to the weak but not to the strong, that justice depends on political calculation rather than moral principle, corroded military ethics in ways that would resurface in later conflicts. Abu Ghraib, My Lai, and other American military scandals have roots in the institutional choices made in 1945 to prioritize reputation over accountability. The price was also paid in lost moral clarity about World War II itself. The good war narrative, Americans as unambiguous heroes fighting pure evil, became harder to sustain once the fuller picture emerged. This does not create moral equivalence between Allied and Axis crimes. Nazi Germany's industrial genocide remains historically unique in scale and intent. But it does complicate the simple story, forcing acknowledgement that even just wars involve moral compromises and criminal acts, that wearing the right uniform does not automatically confer righteousness. For Germany, the revelation created its own complex dynamics. Some used Allied war crimes to engage in false equivalence, arguing that German atrocities were no worse than those committed by victors. This was intellectually dishonest. A handful of prisoner massacres do not compare to the Holocaust, but it provided rhetorical ammunition for those seeking to rehabilitate German reputation. More thoughtfully, some German historians argued that acknowledging all wartime crimes, including Allied violations, created a more honest historical record that actually strengthened rather than weakened condemnation of Nazi Germany by refusing to traffic in propaganda and myth. The silence extracted its heaviest toll from the concept of justice itself. Every crime that goes unpunished corrodes the principle that wrongdoing has consequences, that laws constrain power, that rights mean something. The 80 murdered Germans were denied justice not because evidence was lacking or because legal mechanisms failed, but because powerful men decided justice was inconvenient. That decision reverberates through history, a precedent that encourages future war criminals to calculate that they too might escape accountability if they serve the right cause or command sufficient power. Perhaps the deepest price was philosophical. The revelation forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths about morality in war. If good people fighting for just causes could commit war crimes, if the liberators of concentration camps could murder prisoners, if the soldiers who defeated fascism could become executioners, then what does this say about human nature, about the corrupting influence of violence, about the fragility of moral restraint? The massacre and its cover-up proved that context does not excuse crime, that suffering does not justify atrocity, that righteous causes do not sanctify all actions taken in their name. The Americans who killed those 80 Germans had seen Dachau, had lost friends to German fire, had every emotional and psychological reason to hate their enemy. But hatred does not transform murder into justice. The law exists precisely to constrain what rage and trauma might otherwise produce. And when the law fails through institutional cowardice, civilization itself fails. 70 years after the massacre, the German government erected a small memorial at the approximate location of the killings. The inscription, in German and English, reads simply, "To the unknown dead, 80 German soldiers murdered after surrender, April 1945. The memorial does not name perpetrators or make accusations. It simply acknowledges what happened and honors those who were denied even the dignity of marked graves. American veterans organizations initially protested the memorial, arguing it was insulting to American soldiers who had fought honorably. But some veterans, including survivors who had witnessed the massacre, supported it. One wrote in a letter to the memorial committee, "For 50 years, I carried the shame of what I saw and did nothing to stop." This memorial says what I could not say, acknowledges what should have been acknowledged decades ago. It does not dishonor American service. It honors the truth, which is the only foundation for genuine honor. The price of silence ultimately was a moral debt that accumulated interest across generations. The cover-up saved Patton's reputation and protected American triumphalism in 1945. But it cost American credibility. corroded military justice, and created a historical stain that resists all attempts at whitewashing. The 80 Germans remained unavenged, their murders unpunished, their deaths barely acknowledged, a monument to the proposition that power can suppress truth but cannot destroy it. That institutional silence eventually breaks under the weight of its own contradictions. We are left with questions that have no satisfying answers. Would justice have been possible in 1945? Perhaps not. The political and cultural conditions made accountability nearly impossible. But the attempt would have mattered, would have established that America held itself to the standards it claimed to represent. The failure to even attempt justice transformed American moral authority from principle into propaganda, from genuine standard into convenient weapon to be deployed selectively against enemies while excusing friends. The massacre happened. The cover-up succeeded. The truth eventually emerged, and we are left to grapple with what it means that even the most justified war in modern history, fought against genuinely monstrous evil, still produced American war crimes that were deliberately suppressed rather than prosecuted, and what that says about our willingness to actually enforce the principles we claim to hold sacred when enforcement becomes difficult or embarrassing. The price of silence, it turns out, is paid not just by those directly involved, but by everyone who claims to believe that justice, human rights, and the rule of law are more than rhetorical weapons to be deployed against enemies and abandoned when they constrain friends. The 80 murdered Germans call out to us across 8 decades, asking not for vengeance, but for acknowledgement, that they lived, that they were killed, that the killing was wrong, and that suppressing the truth was a second crime that infected everything that followed. We cannot give them justice. We can only give them truth. And in doing so, perhaps, begin to understand what justice actually requires.